Welcome to Courage to Advance, the Leadership and Transformation podcast. I'm your host, Kim Bohr, and I'm joined today by Sandy Stelling to discuss how KPIs don't tell the whole story and why your CEO valuation is falling short. So before we jump in, I want our listeners to learn more about our fabulous guests today. Sandy is most recently served as the Vice President of Strategy, Analytics, and Transformation at Alaska Airlines, a Pacific Northwest aviation leader for over 30 years. She drives change using her experience in engineering, technology, team dynamics, and process performance. She's been recognized for her highly collaborative, always curious, direct leadership style. And Sandy believes deeply in building capability and creating capacity with individuals and teams. Her track record for building trust and coaching teams, leading through challenges and crisis, and delivering financial results bring valuable perspectives to the boardroom. Sandy holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Lehigh University, and she currently holds leadership roles on several nonprofit boards, which makes her an excellent guest for us today. Sandy, welcome to the Courage to Advance podcast.
Thanks, Kim. Happy to be here.
So you and I have talked a little bit about this as we got ready for our conversation today, and really where I think it's the best place for us to start for our listeners is really to talk a little bit about the role of a board member and the role in evaluating the CEO, and what does that look like from your experience?
Sure. So if I think back to when I first joined a nonprofit board, I think the simplistic view was always your responsibility as a board member is to ensure that the organization delivers financially and has financial health. And that also goes hand in hand with like advocacy and philanthropy. And so in the nonprofit world, it was really like the KPIs were the dollars and cents of the business. Of the organization and its ability to earn money and fund their mission and keep the work going. And I think just like with any for-profit business, the world's changed. The game has changed, and that isn't enough anymore, which can sound daunting, but I think the fact is it's not enough anymore. And when we talk about sustainable organizations and the ability for organizations to grow, just hitting the numbers isn't going to guarantee success. It's important, but it isn't the whole story.
And how does that shift the responsibility of the board members and what their role is often seen to have?
Well, I think what I found working with different CEOs or leadership teams, these organizations, is there's always the conversation about what we're going to do, the goals we're going to set, what we're going to achieve, how we're going to grow the organization or have greater impact. But I think what really has come to the forefront are the human dynamics that are in play when that's happening. Mm-hmm. Because it's in my personal perspective, I think it's more of a guarantor of success or not. Is because if you have strong teams, they can achieve anything. But if you have dysfunction within teams, or you have personality clashes or style clashes, or just lack of good communication, or whatever those human dynamics are, that can be a non-starter, right? And can really get in the way of achieving a lot of what you're going after.
And how is that? Do you see that as creating more risk inside from the board's point of view of how they're viewing what's going on? Can you speak a little bit from that lens as well?
I would say at the worst case, if you have, and I've had the opportunity to be a board member in the gamut when things were great and when things were not so great. And in not so great, I think what happens is it actually pulls the whole organization down and can end up even pulling some board members into it. Because different people will reach out to the board members that they have a good relationship with, people that they trust. And then all of a sudden you're creating a little bit of chaos in how the organization is intended to run. When really the board is typically, in my experience, working directly with the CEO, definitely has interactions with the leadership team, But the board's responsibility is to ensure the performance of the CEO, and then that CEO has to extend down and get results with their organization. So what I've seen happen is when it's working well, right, then the board's job becomes super easy in some ways, right? Because you're coaching, you're supporting, you may be asking challenging questions just to mitigate and manage any risks that you may be aware of because of the experience you bring to the board. But the team is working together, and a lot of that diversity of thoughts coming out organically within the team, within the leadership team of the organization. When it's a little bit fractured, or there's some other kind of stress or tension in the system, I think what happens is the conversations are different, because now they're about team dynamics and less about the work that we're trying to get accomplished, right?
Right.
And you're trying to wade through some other problems. So it as much as you want to say as a board member, it's not your responsibility. When you talk about the sustainability and the risk and success of an organization, you do have to have a little bit of a lens into the culture and the dynamics of how people are working together or not working together, because that'll start to send up signals if things are really off track, or if something is at risk of going off track.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And so when a moment ago, you were speaking about how the landscape has changed, and that looking at these financial metrics isn't enough alone. So can you speak to that lens of how the layering of more of the empathy and the emotional intelligence lens has come into play into the board's, role of taking in that level of data as well?
Yeah, whether it's depending on the size of the board, the CEO will have different depths of relationship with different board members. So for a period of time, I was in a leadership role. I was a chair of a board, and working with the CEO of the board, I think one thing is to really build trust, because what I would recognize, and even in my professional career, working directly for the CEO of a company, that's like the loneliest job out there.
Yes.
And probably a reason it's not for me, but I can see why. But I do think it's a tough place to be. And I think having a relationship with some board members that recognize that can acknowledge that can create a safe space for a CEO. I felt that was really important and part of my responsibility, so that they had a place to turn. They had somewhere to go to talk about what was on their mind. And so I think I naturally lead that way in the roles that I held. And so I carried that into my work as a board member. And I think that unlocked some things, some conversations, some relationships, some trust. It allowed I saw the CEO and even other members of the team feel not comfortable, but capable of being vulnerable, where otherwise maybe they felt like, we don't want the board to know. We'll just keep it, It's like, no, we're actually all on the same team.
Right.
And
that
kind of
vulnerability is huge to unlock that.
Yes. And so I think that that to me is a big key to growth, right? If you can be vulnerable together, then you can actually discover and I think explore growth that otherwise wouldn't be available to you.
I love that. That's so important. And I think that's, I think we've come a long way in our journey of leadership understanding to recognize that now there's strength in this bringing in vulnerability and empathy and, EQ and all of these things that perhaps were not seen as important as they are
I think
now.
a phrase I've used is over our career lifetimes, we've heard it. These are the soft skills. Like you have technical hard skills, you know how to execute your job. You can, balance the budget and deliver the results, and all the KPIs can happen. And people will then refer to this other stuff that we're talking about as the soft skills. And I argue that till the cows come home, because I'm like, those are the essential skills.
Yes. I love that.
Then it's irregardless of what the mission is, what the work is, what the job or task at hand is. If you can't navigate with these essential skills, you're kind of going to be stuck. It's going to be harder.
Yes, these essential skills are they're the foundation. And that's what we've talked about, the inputs to understand the outputs. Because at some point you could have a CEO with fantastic metrics, and if the inputs and the dynamics inside the organization are really toxic, there's going to be a cliff for those metrics. That performance won't really, in most cases, be able to sustain. And the turnover and the disconnect of the leadership teams and things really starts to become apparent.
And I think that's where the board has a role, not to get involved in it, not to solve some of those dynamics, like that's not our place, but it is to be listening for, observing for, because our primary responsibility is to help manage risk to the organization, right, in its current year and future years. And so if, and what everybody wants in an organization is, risk that's well managed and predictable outcomes, and you achieve your goals, and, it's all just works great. But I think as a board, then the biggest responsibility we have is to be able to, from a removed space, again, not in the day-to-day, observe and listen for things that are risk, and it's not always evident just in the numbers.
Right.
Right.
That alone
And I
doesn't
think
tell the whole story.
it doesn't tell the whole story. And so it's understanding, to your point, what was the process that got us that number? and what's the collateral damage that maybe was incurred to get there? And
Right.
is that tolerable or sustainable? And what could be the downstream consequences of that kind of behaviors?
And I think for many of us, we think of it as followership, right? So gaining, building followership is a skill. And when you think about these inputs that bring into play so many of these really important skills that CEOs and leaders need to have, that's such an important factor to that input of where we're going to look at and the other end of it. So just to pause for a moment and to make sure our listeners are clear on what we're thinking about when we talk about CEO evaluations, there is a gamut of how this is done. For many organizations, it's where we started off by saying that, perhaps just the hard numbers, the hard KPIs, the hard goals are the way it's done. And for many listening, maybe they don't realize this other idea is actually really prominent and really is a more complete view than perhaps the traditional way alone. And so we're not advocating to throw that out, of course, that is key. We're advocating to expand it to make it more comprehensive in a way that's so beneficial. And in the work that we've both experienced before, that could look like 360s with key layers in the organization, including board members. It can look at interview conversations that are looking for trends and things like that. And I think one of the things that we find in the work is that data is key. And so the way we approach looking at this expanded, more complete view is still a very much a data-driven approach. And I wonder if you could speak to a little bit of how that data-driven approach can, in fact, occur in these areas of skills that we're talking about that maybe are these now what we think of as essential skills.
Yeah. Well, I think that, so first of all, the data is still important. I'm not going to throw out the data here,
Right.
And the data has served well, especially over years. If you're working with the same CEO and there's some over time, you can see trends or movement. But even again, in my professional life, when you got data, and honestly, working in an airline, we're rich in data, but data is only useful if you can actually translate it into information.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
So that's where all the nuance and complexity lives, right? So, and that I think is where the interviews and some of the written feedback and some of the more qualitative insights come from, help interpret the data. Because the data is on a 0 to 5 scale, you're getting all 5s. Or all 5s, but 1, 2. Well, I'm curious about the 2.
Right.
Because the 2 alone it's interesting, but it doesn't tell me anything.
Right.
So how do we then follow up with conversations to learn what that two is actually telling us? Because that's where the improvement, the growth, and the change is going to come from, right? Otherwise,
Absolutely.
because the flip side of that is it's very easy if the data is not coming with insights and information that you can act on, it's easy to accept it when it's good and it's easy to dismiss it when it's bad.
Right.
And so you need, and people are complex. So Kim, you're a 5 and you're like, that's interesting, but it tells you nothing.
Right.
So we have to
Right.
we have to get deeper into what are we learning? You know, what does this process, and we have a more comprehensive process that involves a 360, as you mentioned. We have conversations. A subset of board members then work, you know, with our partners to figure out like the people who help us collect the data to understand like what's actually happening and how do we take all of this information, not just data, and have constructive conversations that will not only support the CEO, but in turn then support the organization. Because that's what, as a board, we're really trying to do is ensure we have the right leader leading in a way that's going to grow, you know, support the organization in the way that we intend them to. But it is, I find data, it's very easy to be like, we're data driven. Only if you can turn it into something useful and actionable.
Right.
Otherwise, you're just data drowning. And I
Right.
think that that's, you know, that would be easy to say like, well, we have a process and we collect data and then we hang it on the fridge. I mean, you have to do
Yeah,
something with it. And you
you
have to be
do.
able to interpret it in ways that become actionable.
And I think one of the things that stood out to what you were just saying too is that longitudinal view, right? The
Yeah.
view of the the consistency. So can you speak to where that consistency comes, how critical it is from not just the process, but the board being on the same page, you know, around how everybody's going to view what the inputs are. I'd love to hear a little bit more about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. You know, one thing I think that's bringing this more to the forefront and maybe a conversation is I think in, you know, in the for-profit world, right, leadership is changing as well. Right. So even board members who now serve on nonprofits are coming from different experiences than maybe were had in the workplace 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And a lot of this, I think, has been accelerated with COVID, to be honest, with the pandemic, because there were so many things that happened in 2020, 21, 22 that really required leaders to lead differently. And I think that, you know, and it was like a step change because all of a sudden, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but you had to care about your employees in a whole new way.
Right.
And the people you lead needed things in a whole different way. So the needs were different. The climate was, everything was different. So where longitudinal is interesting, so I'm gonna go back to that, is you can see progress. You may also then spot like setbacks. But even if you, like if something slides backwards, let's just say that numbers go the other way, it allows you to have a conversation to understand what was going on. And it allows for that, if you have trust and vulnerability and the ability and empathy and the ability to have these conversations, you can actually move through it, I would say, more quickly because you're able to like have that safe space conversation and say, hey, you know, what happened here? Well, this is what was going on. Oh, well, that makes sense. And then you can acknowledge that was a hiccup, or that's a red flag, or that's a blind spot, or actually that's a pattern we're seeing. And what does that mean? You know, and you're able to have a conversation that is growth oriented and not like penalizing, if that makes it, that's like a strong
Right.
word, but it's not to be like, you're bad. It's like, well, this is interesting.
Right.
And nobody wants to do a bad job.
Exactly. Exactly. I think, you know, I love that you talk about being growth oriented because that's like, even I think there's a misperception that when somebody becomes a CEO, they've hit their pinnacle and they don't either think they need to grow or people don't think they need to grow. And of course they need to grow. We all need to grow in our different levels. It changes, and that type of feedback is really critical. As you said earlier, it's pretty lonely and there's a lot less feedback when you're getting further up into the leadership roles. I think the other thing I want to just call out that you said, which is so important too, is that during those years of our pandemic life, and where the needs that we all had became so much more of a focus in ways that even maybe many of us didn't even realize needed to be, that hasn't gone away. And so as we move forward into, our business of the future, the needs that people have are still there. And so it's not like we traded those back off to not having as much. And I think that is really, it makes the stakes even higher for a CEO and a board in trying to make sure that's being viewed as part of these inputs as well. I'd love for you to share, a story, if you have one, that really can perhaps talk about the, gaining trust and alignment, with a CEO when you've either brought the idea of this level of a depth to that person, or perhaps just the results, and how have the results, gained more of that, is if you have something that you can share with the listeners.
Well, I think that I remember when we were engaged in the CEO evaluation process and working with the CEO, the one conversation that always comes to mind was, and again, we all come from different backgrounds and different experiences, right? But as the few board members who work on this process were discussing and preparing for the evaluation conversation, we kept coming back to the organization led by the CEO is hitting all the numbers, like check, 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 check. But we also knew firsthand accounts, witness, engage with, stories that we heard, conversations that we had, conversations with the CEO, that there was some turmoil happening. And that became concerning as a board member of like, so they hit the numbers, and I think you mentioned it earlier, but I'm not confident. I want to be, but I'm not sure I can be confident they're going to hit them again next year or to the next year, unless this turmoil is somehow addressed. And the conversation, which I think kind of stopped us all in our tracks, was, so the whats are good, but the how is a little concerning. And I think that they're both equally important. Sustainability for the organization, right? And if you were going to do the same thing day after day, year after year, maybe some of that could exist, right? Because you're just going to bang out the same numbers all the time,
Right?
But that isn't the way the world works. So how do you have the dynamics in play and the human dynamics in play that can be nimble enough and adaptive enough to work together when these things are shifting and changing? And we kind of joke, a number of the board members and I have joked about, like, it seems like every year there's like a thing. And, and like, so what's the thing for this year? And there's usually I wouldn't say like an existential crisis, but there is some sort of event or something that happens that makes the organization like pause and say, okay, wait a second. We have to shift resources. We have to shift direction. We have to pull back. Something's happening, right? And I think that's true for any organization, right? That something happens.
Yeah.
And if you don't have, and again, this is my perspective, if you don't have the leadership in place and the team working together, it's really hard to then make those shifts and adapt without losing your footing, right? Without losing some footing. And so I think that when we've worked, so when we were having the conversation of, yes, you hit all of the whats, the goals, you achieve the goals, or you missed one or two, fine, but majority you hit all the goals. But we want to have a conversation about how you got there and some of the concerns we see as a board. And it wasn't you're a bad person. That's not it. We're concerned about the health of the organization being able to sustain the progress to deliver results year after year after year. And that's our responsibility. And that's where our concern was showing up and I think that was the beginning of what has been a good multi-year conversation and relationship of how, one, we're there because we support, we believe, we have confidence. But we want to support also some like adjustments, little adjustments here and there to make the organization stronger. And how can we be resources to help him or her do that?
And so it sounds like in that scenario, that information was received as a supportive delivery, as not a, punitive, as you said, but more of
Right.
this, okay, I've got support to help figure
Yeah.
this out.
I mean, I think I think what also happens as a CEO, having worked with several of them, part of the reason I think the role becomes lonely is a lot of what you hear has also been thoroughly filtered by the time it gets to you. So,
Yeah.
so the question is, do you have an environment, or do you have a few safe places you can go to have like the let your hair down conversation, like the real, get to the
Yes.
real. And I think that's the level of trust that I think I felt that we created. I think that we have with a handful of board members that can just really let the hair down and say, this is real. And the CEO can feel like that's a safe space and that conversations are confidential. And we're there because we have their back,
Mhm.
right? And it's because we, along with the CEO, believe in the mission and the goals of the organization. And that's what this is about. This isn't about you're a good person, you're a bad person, do more of this. That's tactics underneath the cause. And everyone I've worked with in nonprofit, it's such mission driven work. I mean, I was fortunate to work for a public company that was also very mission driven. So it's in my DNA as anyway, worked out, good alignment there. But I think that definitely in nonprofit, people who go work for nonprofits is because they believe deeply in the mission.
Mhm.
And always coming back to that, I think, is a really helpful way to open those conversations up and make more safe spaces to explore what can be adjusted or adapted for better performance.
I think that's so important. And so I want to just explore a little bit further on the board, and the board itself needing to align within itself as to how we're going to take in this type of data, or how we're going to find consistency year over year. So you spoke to, knowing that we've adopted a specific process and knowing things like that. But how do you navigate the reality that board roles evolve? There's terms to them, and people, typically are moving through, and so what kind of conversations are happening in those smaller, teams of the board around, how are we going to commit to this and be consistent, and knowing that we're only holding these positions for so long? Is there anything you can speak to there?
I think that you know, I'm very process oriented. I'm an engineer, unapologetically, but I think that my mindset works in a way, and I'm not unique in this, but there are others on the board who share this, is we're also responsible to ensure our processes support sustainability of the organization. And right, so not just the organization, like CEO on down, is going to be sustainable. We have to make sure that the board functions in an ongoing, effective way as well. And so I think we've collectively made a commitment, like to, in some way, like document these processes, shared them, onboard people transitioning. So it isn't just handing over a playbook to someone else and be like, good luck.
Yeah.
And so that's one part of it. I think the other thing that the other board members I've had the privilege to work with, I think we've also aligned and committed to continuous improvement.
Mm,
And
I like
so
that.
even every year we may follow essentially the same process. Every year we're also going, could we do this different now? Like maybe we should adjust how we did this. We did this last year, but we knew you're not going to get perfect, but you can continue to
Mhm.
get better. And I think always having that, maybe it's the growth orientation that
Mhm.
if we want to continue to serve our CEO well, we have to make sure that we're continuing to reflect on our process and improve it, and take the feedback and continue to work it, because that is also going to serve him and the organization, him or her and the organization well.
And where does it sounds like some of that transparency, do you advocate for some of that, hey, how we as a board were thinking about this, to translate into a conversation with the CEO, and in kind of how the thinking has evolved?
Yeah, we're very transparent. I mean, first of all, we're fortunate to have a CEO who's incredibly transparent. So, our CEO is very comfortable sharing the results with the full board. And I think those conversations are helpful because anyone who takes, does an evaluation, takes a survey, wants to know that like someone's looking at the results
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
someone's going to take action on the results, right? Like what's the number one issue with employee surveys at companies? I take the employee survey,
Yeah.
nobody does anything about it, right? That's like, you hear
Right.
that all the time.
Right.
And so I think having the transparency of like, here's what we said. And then he or she also, like CEO, our CEO, again, very transparent, shares their goals based on the prior year's evaluation of what we're setting up, not only with the board, but with their team.
Mhm.
Right. So again, we're all in this together.
Yes.
Right. And it creates a space, of accountability, but it also creates a support system because now everyone knows what they're trying to do and is in a position to help them.
Mm-hmm. Love that. So if you were, giving advice to somebody who was, a board member out there and our listeners and wants to really open up this conversation with a CEO or an executive director around, let's look at this in a more expanded view. Let's be inclusive of what we do today. And here's where we want to, where we think there's more opportunity. What would you advise them in approaching that conversation? Perhaps some of the things you would say, have them, suggest they say.
Yeah, so I tend to use like pretty plain language that creates images, right? Just like, so I would be like, let's say they have historically been measured on what they achieve, right? The numbers, the KPIs. I would start having, I wouldn't be like, let's go get a big survey and let's get a third party and let's go do this, because all of a sudden the CEO is going to feel threat, right? I would imagine that's how probably I would respond if everyone's like, we're going to do all this to you. I would probably respond as like, threat alert, what's going on? And I would be so paranoid to be like, what did I do wrong? Right. That's who I would become. I'd be like, what? But I do think that opening a conversation of always getting better and having conversations about some of the things, I think the examples of challenges that were recently faced, right? Especially when it comes to
Yes.
like human dynamics, interactions, team stuff, employee stuff, whatever it is,
Yeah.
being able to point to those and say, and some of them would be, let them lead the story, right? They're going to tell a story of like working with one of their leaders and blah, 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 whatever the issue is. Okay. How would you like to handle that different? And maybe that's part of what we want to bring into the evaluation is how you handle difficult conversations. I'm oversimplifying, but
Right.
something like that. But some of those kinds of dynamics. But I think letting the CEO tell stories of where they're struggled, which again, you have to have trust and vulnerability and be able to have that. And then look at ways to expand the evaluation to start to surface some of those kinds of behaviors. Is probably the way I would approach stepping into it, as opposed to like bringing in the program.
Yes.
Feel like you're subjecting them, all of a sudden they become a victim of a thing,
Right.
as opposed to owning their desire to grow, owning that and saying, I actually do want growth. And this is one of the ways we can help do that.
Yeah. I hear you describing, partnership, curiosity, co-creation, co-involvement, and what can we do to help look at your growth, also to help tell your fuller story, in many ways. So I think those are really important factors, and moving away from a position that feels like it's, us versus them.
And I think
And yeah,
you want to get to a richer conversation where it isn't just like a checklist. Like I do the things, I exhibit the behaviors. It's a little bit like what you do, how you do it. And then I think when you get deeper into these conversations, and I've had this opportunity with people that I've, worked with in my professional career, you actually start to get, and that really becomes interesting because like, again, it's just be curious about yourself. Why do you respond that way? Why would I feel threat? Right.
right.
Right. And you get into some of the why, and then because you want to make sure that everyone involved feels like they have agency. And so
Yes.
if the CEO feels like they're being subjected to something because the board is imposing something, they're never really going to have that agency over, their leadership,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're just a part in a play as
Right.
opposed to the star of their own show. And I think it's really changing that up. And I think I don't mean it to sound manipulative at all. I think it's just it's leaning into human nature
Mm-hmm.
in a way to unlock more better performance, which is what each individual wants anyway. Who doesn't want to be their best?
Absolutely. And
That's
I
why
love,
oversimplify it.
right. Well, it's that's the a perfect example. And I love the word agency because I think that is something that everybody wants to
Mhm.
have. And, I've heard, this gives CEOs and the board and, opportunity to have more collaboration as
Mhm.
well. But for the CEO in particular, there is more control in looking at how do I go about doing this, not just solely what I got, because of that, I think that element of things feeling thankless at times, there's a lot to celebrate too when we look at the inputs, the how we got there, that is really should be surfaced and can be missed when we're only focused on those metrics alone, right?
I mean, when you can play to your strengths, kind of where you're going
Yeah.
with this, when you can play to your strengths, you can find ways to use them in maybe circumstances you didn't anticipate,
Yeah.
right? And so that's one thing I think that this creates the potential to discover some of that,
Yes.
right? So if you're really good at storytelling, but I never actually used my storytelling skill to talk about the financial performance of the institution. I'm making it up, right? But you could.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden you're going to connect with a whole new audience and engage with different employees in different ways, or the board or other things can happen. That's one piece I think is really powerful when you kind of get into that work,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I personally find it fun, but hard, right? Because
Right.
it's sometimes you find things you didn't want to find.
This is true.
Right? You discover you have to come to terms with your own blind spots and go, yeah, I do that.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
if you can name it, then you can handle it.
Absolutely. And especially when you have a strong
Yeah.
team within your board that's going to support you in that process too. So before we wrap up, I want to ask, or at least maybe expand our conversation a little bit to the opportunity of, we've talked about how the board's role, we've talked about the CEO and evaluating and expanding in this way. We're thinking of one of the things I think is not always connected to this type of conversation is the benefit it brings to the organization itself, to the leaders who report to the CEO, to creating an opportunity to align an evaluation to perhaps maybe aspects of how others are evaluated on their performance throughout the organization. And I'm curious if you have any, thoughts or experiences in that way where you could say, yeah, it creates even a healthy organization, situation that expands into that level of the
Yeah.
organization, where those dynamics are bigger.
Yeah, I think, for the 360 process we use very much involves the leadership team that reports to the CEO. And so they also participate in the evaluation, they participate in interviews. And I think it's important for the board to hear from them, right? So we hear that
Mhm.
through the data and the insights that come from conversations, right? We hear
Mhm.
from them. And, there have been times where that has been very insightful for us because the board has one view and the leadership team had a very different view.
Mhm.
And that became a place to explore. Why is that? What's going on? Why are the experiences so different? Or the interpretations of the experiences so different? What's going, and I think it was helpful to have that, to help the CEO understand, like, and even explore that. This is interesting. And, they're kind of in the middle of it, but why do you think this is? What's going on? How can we
Mhm.
help? Um, And that's always tricky too, because we're not an operational board. We're just there to support, and work with the CEO and the team. But we want to make sure like we're not doing his job or her job.
Yep.
But we want to help them and support them, right, in that way. So I think hearing from the people who actually are working with the CEO day in and day out is a rich insight that a board member wouldn't generally have.
Mhm.
Right. And I think
Definitely.
it definitely rounds out the picture. But I also think the CEO's self-evaluation as part of the 360 process is also insightful. And, they'll mark themselves again, year over year, what's happening. They'll mark themselves high, they'll mark themselves low. What's going on? What
Yeah.
makes you think that? And then it does give us an opportunity to actually recognize strong performance where they're maybe being hypercritical and say, are you
Right.
like, from our perspective, like, I hear what you're saying, but you should know from our perspective, we think you've done fantastic at XYZ, at navigating problem, A, whatever. And so those opportunities also come out of a process like this, where you get to recognize the strengths and the goodness, not just we're here to grow, we're here to improve, it's all we're about. We're like, no, let's take a couple minutes and take some time and honor the strengths you bring to the table every day, how it shows up, how people see it.
Mhm.
Even if sometimes you get caught up and don't see it, you get swept up in it and you don't
Right.
see it. Like, don't
Right.
forget, you've got really great qualities that got you here.
Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
you're not here by accident, right? You're not the
Right.
CEO of the organization by accident. But always having a growth mindset is not a bad way to move through the world, because the world is constantly changing.
Absolutely. And I think just, for CEOs that can bring that level of insight and transparency back to that executive team that participated, I think that has the opportunity to just not only show that vulnerability, but strengthen those relationships too. And so it's that comes full circle
Right.
for everybody involved. So as we wrap up, is there anything you want to make sure you share that perhaps we haven't touched on, or you want to reinforce as we bring our conversation to a close?
Big question. It's a big open question. Again, just to bring it home, I think we can talk about process and we can talk about evaluations and we can talk about data and we can get all into it. But you have to remember, it's humans.
Mhm.
Human beings are complicated, they're messy.
Yeah,
And any process that's evaluating the performance and effectiveness of another human being, there's risk involved. So I would just say focus on growth orientation and creating safe spaces for those conversations and the curiosity. Because then I think you have the best shot at unlocking potential.
agreed. The fabulous words to end on. So what I'll want to share with our listeners is that we have 3 downloads for you. If you visit the website couragetoadvancepodcast.com, it will take you to our Spark Effect page, and there you'll be able to download 1 or all 3 of these. And just to give you a snippet about each, the first download's a guide to those that are tasked with finding the process or finding a right partner, and addresses really important items that are needed to ensure successful evaluations. So much of what needs to be gathered in order for the board's interest in the CEOs. The second download addresses CEOs, highlighting how this expanded view reveals the behind the scenes factors contributing to the outcome. So the hows and the inputs and the benefit to the CEO of thinking of it from this lens. And then the third download is really for board members. And it really is much about what we've talked about here today. Whether you're on a nonprofit or a for-profit board, it ties into covering how do you assess the risk and build trust between the CEO and the board in a way that's really effective. And so you can find these links in the show notes, and you can also connect with us on LinkedIn. That'll be in the show notes as well. And I want to just thank you again, Sandy, for sharing your insights and what you've brought to our conversation today. And I want to thank our listeners who've joined us today on our Courage to Advance
Well, thanks,
podcast.
Thanks, Kim. It's been really fun. It's a great conversation.
I really enjoyed it as well. We'll hope to hear and from you more in the future, Sandy, and we'll look forward to our listeners tuning in on our next episode. Thank you.